What do people not know about Nietzsche?
Well, so I only did a couple of weeks on him at university,
Oh, right,
so I don't know much. The feeling I got from the little bit we read was, although he's very much about sort of overcoming some aspects of our sort of base humanity or something, I couldn't. It felt almost a little bit elitist. I couldn't feel that there was much of a feeling for kind of thinking about where people's starting point is or what the conditions surrounding them were. And I don't know if we weren't exposed to that, or whether it is sort of absent in his philosophy.
That's something. Yes, it's something to be discussed. I mean, certainly, whether yes, but I've been getting into it. I asked the question. Well, I was ambitious to begin with. I asked if people could come up with 3 things that they didn't know, not 3 things they knew, but 3 things they didn't know about Nietzsche. Gets you to think.
I suppose I would say how his thinking ties in with our Buddhist practice today.
Yeah, and I'd say the same, because it's talking about godless society on the invitation, isn't it? And
Right.
what interests me is whether it can be applied as some sort of cohesion strategy for modern society.
I think we need to have the door a bit open because people are still arriving.
I suppose I don't know why he's so kind of popular in a way.
Right.
The other philosophers aren't, or
Yes,
still relevant.
I'm with Mike on that. That was going to be my.
You're right. Yes.
I mean, I don't know about his kind of cultural impact.
Right. So we're doing a round of people saying what they don't know about Nietzsche.
How about, because a lot of his ideas seem to be about how to live in
Right.
various ways. Did he manage to embody those in his own life? Or?
Right. Well, that's. Yes, I mean that's a good question as well. I mean, one might ask the question: well, could anyone actually? I mean, in some ways, it was his model was so ambitious in a way that no single person or anyone would ever fully embody the idea. I mean, it would be, or at least what he seemed to think was necessary. Oh yeah.
I don't know the political context or just the context that led to him kind of creating his kind of
Right.
philosophical sort of outlook. I'm curious about that. I'm not sure.
Okay, I think that might be where I could start. Because in a way, the context goes back and back and back. I mean, he said at one point that he thought that, I mean, most of his most famous writings appeared in the 1880s. And he wrote some things in the 1870s as well, so I mean, it's sort of late 19th century. He wrote, or thought at the time, that he thought that the situation that people were in his time, more or less the present, had come around to where people were 2,000 years ago. It's a bit like we thought that we'd done a great big loop of 2,000 years, and now we're kind of back to the situation before the arrival of Christianity. It was a bit like he was taking a kind of survey of sort of philosophy, cultural history in general, and thought that there was a kind of cycle of Christianity that had come and had gone, or was in the process of going. So we were kind of back again, having to answer the questions that people thought were answered once and for all by Christianity. And during the years that Christianity was the dominant cultural force, it didn't occur to anyone that Christianity, could actually go, or might have, might actually, it would come and go as a historical phenomena.
I was just wondering, because before Christianity, I guess people also thought they had the answers as well, right?
Well, much less so. but besides which, if you go to the period before Christianity became the official, the religion of the Roman Empire, and from then on of Christian Europe, there wasn't a political power who saw it as its job to enforce belief in what was true. Kind of, there wasn't. It wasn't the business of the state to tell people or impose on people what they should believe. I mean, the Romans were almost sort of between famous and notorious for this. They didn't really care as long as people paid their taxes, and made a formal sacrifice to the emperor. Beyond that, they could believe what they wanted, and century after century, people debated. I mean, there was someone, a satirist called Lucian, from the 2nd century, who was who seemed not to believe in anything, and he was immensely popular. In fact, there are actually more manuscripts, as many manuscripts surviving of his works than of anyone else from antiquity. And he wrote kind of comic dialogues in which the gods appear as sort of comic characters. I mean, it's kind of like Monty Python 2,000 years before Monty Python. I mean, he was the first Life of Brian, even before Christianity. And although people nowadays probably don't know about Lucian, or they don't read his works. The people who did read him in the days when people still read him produced some of the popular fiction that people still read. I mean, Lucian, he wrote the first trip to the moon. I mean, men voyage into outer space where no one has ever been before. Lucian was there before Star Trek, and he was an inspiration to Gulliver's Travels, so I mean, he invented genres that are still alive, and he didn't seem to. I mean, he was. Well, in the ancient world, you could be a cynic. That was a valid philosophical school, which meant you basically suspended. Well, the skeptics suspended judgment, but the cynics sort of went a bit further and thought that just about everything that was said and everything that everyone sacrificed to or looked up to was laughable or not to be taken seriously, and that the only thing that that really mattered was how you lived your life. There was a story about Diogenes. Diogenes, one of the originators of cynicism, that the city where he lived was under attack, and everyone was busy taking it very, 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 very seriously, getting ready to repel the attackers. And Diogenes, who lived in a barrel, who was famous for living in a barrel, spent the time rolling his barrel up and down the street. Just that's all he was doing, so rolling his barrel along. And people came up to him a bit exasperated when, at this time of national danger, can you find nothing better to do than roll your barrel up and down the street? And Diogenes said, well, seeing that everyone looks so busy, I felt I ought to be doing something. So, in a sense, that was, the cynics were there in the ancient world, as the spokesman for, that the only thing that really matters is just to be. And of course, they have their modern successors, in the 60s, and so in a way there are these sort of stances or positions that can come and go over millennia. So Nietzsche felt that the historical moment that he was in was important, and in a way that was the key. He lived in the 19th century, and one of the features of the 19th century characterizing many different people was that one thing just about everybody agreed in the 19th century, that the meaning of life, or the answer, was to be found in the proper understanding of history, which meant finding out the origin of things. The origin of things, if you could find out how things started, how they originated, then you understood. You had a handle on what it was. And of course, one of the things that came under historical scrutiny was the whole idea of God. The 19th century was just about the first century where, as never before, the notion of God, the deity, religion, was treated as a historical phenomena that would have historical origins, and inevitably it was traced back and back and back to barbarians and tribes in grass skirts, and the kind of and Victorians had to thinking sort of the sort of Victorians and 19th century people who kept abreast of the march of progress and had to get used to the idea that the God that they went and worshipped on Sunday probably began as some kind of primitive fetish somewhere in the distant past, and what they were worshipping now by a series of gradations, kind of developed into Anglicanism or German Lutheranism or whatever it was. But of course, the people with the historical, the sort of historicists saying would argue that things don't outgrow their historical origin. And anyway, if God had an origin in history, then that makes him subject to time, and he's not eternal. In fact, the rise of history and the tendency to look at things historically as the dominant approach to every question meant that what went for metaphysics was lost its foundation. So one of Nietzsche is famous for the death of God. And that's one thing he's famous. If people know one thing about Nietzsche, one thing associated with him is the death of God. In a wider sense, he's also, it means the death of metaphysics, which matters because, or mattered then, because for 2,000 years, European notions of what is good and what is bad, what is right and what is wrong, had a metaphysical basis. I mean, certainly through Christianity, and that within a few generations of the writing down of the Gospels, the early Christians, looking around for an intellectual basis for their new faith, decided very early on and quite quickly that Plato, amongst the respected figures of their world, was the person to link up to, which from that time onwards, Christianity more or less was linked with Platonism or some form of Platonism, and that an appeal to Plato gave intellectual credibility to Christian teaching. And the reason why Plato was chosen was that Plato taught that such values as the good and the true and the beautiful have their origin not in this world, the world of the senses, but in a world beyond the senses. Maybe even a world beyond thought, but definitely another world, way, way beyond. Maybe not even conceivable. Even though.
Is this a world with a God?
Well, it got God. it got Godded, in a way. The people from about once the empire was once the Roman Empire was established, things were moving in the direction of having a God, maybe not a personal God. I mean, the idea that Plato had he wrote a work called the Timaeus, in which he imagined a creator, he called the demiurge, who created the world according to some blueprint or kind of plan. Plato's demiurge is somewhat short of the Christian God because he doesn't create out of nothing. He also doesn't create the stuff that he creates from. But Plato's Timaeus was a kind of starting point for a kind of a creation myth for the philosophers that sort of go beyond the Genesis, where God just says let it be and it all springs.
So how did Plato account for the Genesis? So he's got this God that.
Well, he didn't have.
uses the
The Greeks generally assumed that there wasn't a beginning. In fact, it's very common in the ancient world. It's a common assumption that the world doesn't have a beginning. If there's anything, it's kind of cyclical, comes round to where it was, but it always starts again or doesn't have an origin. So, and given that it's a natural belief, if you're starting from the position that there is a world of eternal values that don't change, or basically the ground plan, the sort of foundation of everything never changes. So if it's eternal, why should the universe have a beginning? It could go on forever. It could be infinitely in the past and infinitely in the future. And generally, there wasn't much sense of history. People generally, in the distant past, were more or less as we are now. In the distant future, they will be as we are now. Nothing really changes.
So what does the demiurge create? What does he do?
He sets up attention. And this is, the idea that what animates the world is some basic tension, which sustains the world. It originates with the pre-Socratics. Heraclitus and Empedocles, I think. Good. That the world is sustained by the interplay or opposition between two opposing forces, and Plato's pair, I suppose you could say, would be order and chaos. That's a good candidate. The chaos, the stuff that the demiurge creates from, is pure chaos. It doesn't have a shape or a form. The demiurge, working from kind of pre-existent models, sort of ideal, sort of the ideas of things, the sort of models of things, has one eye on that, does his best to impose on this recalcitrant matter, a reasonable shape according to sort of the ideal, but never gets quite there because he's working with chaos anyway, and you can't. In a way, the universe is like the silk purse from a cow's, a sow's ear. It never quite. It's the world that we have is as close to a silk purse as the sow's ear will allow us, but the real silk purse is up in heaven, in some other world that we're trying to model ourselves after.
So, why is it the demiurge? What's the meaning of demiurge?
It's actually the Greek word for craftsman. Erg. It's the word energy is from the word the ergos in demiurge with the word in. So energy is that which does work, produces something. So
I was just thinking about the prefix demi. Is that the sort of half Is that the meaning?
Yes, he wasn't quite a god. He was a demigod.
Right.
But in but at least the Christians could say that could point to Plato's Timaeus and saying that the world had a beginning. So it agreed with Genesis and added a few things that was created, that God's creation was unrestricted and out of nothing. And
so why do you think the Christian tradition wanted to have a beginning when other traditions, more ancient traditions, had this idea?
Well, because they came out of the origin in Judaism, that had a God, a creator God, who, because he created man, had a personal relationship with man. The thing about the classical the classical gods, they, at least after Homer, increasingly they withdrew and didn't seem to care that much about what human beings did. The human beings got on with things without much reference to them. They weren't as closely. They weren't linked to what human beings do by such kind of visceral emotions as love or anger.
It's a bit like a parent almost, like they've given, if it's a creator God, he's given birth to
Well,
the
our
person.
Father, yes.
Yeah.
That's
So that creates a more intimate connection with the God. Yeah, is that so? These are just two different types.
well, it makes God a lot more touchy.
Right.
It's kind of it's the kind of a God who created you has an emotional investment in how you turn out, and is going to be quite upset if you turn out badly and kind of don't.
In the Old Testament, he gets quite upset.
Oh, yes, he does.
Yeah.
Notoriously so. And the pagans, pointed this out. What sort of, compared to the Olympian gods, what sort of god is this who gets upset and angry and gets that bothered? So really, this is kind of like. So yes, the preamble to we're kind of wind through to the historical moment. So the 19th century was the century in which the gods got dethroned. I mean, in quite a kind of physical sense, in the French Revolution. In the early stages of the French Revolution, there was a desire to create a secular state, in a way to break with the Christian past. The Notre Dame was deconsecrated. They dressed up a Parisian prostitute as the goddess of reason and set her up as a new Virgin Mary. In Notre Dame, they employed artists and propagandists to create substitutes for the processions and pageants of Roman Catholicism. Mobs attacked and ransacked the monasteries. I mean, a lot of medieval artworks disappeared in the French Revolution, and a quite upsurge of a kind of Puritanism, a bit like in the English Puritan Revolution. The heads were knocked off statues, and stained glass was smashed. Where in France, a lot was destroyed. In a great upsurge of feeling against the Catholic past, and cathedrals were overnight turned into museums. You know,
What time did this take place?
well, this would have been probably 1793 or 1794. Certainly, things cooled down a bit, and Napoleon made a compromise with the church, and it did what actually French kings often had done in the past. It captured the Pope, placed him under house arrest, and issued him an ultimatum that he had to agree to show who was master. But I mean, when the Pope agreed to it, signed it. So so the Roman Catholic Church was made kind of subordinate. Gave up its pretensions to be a power above all earthly powers.
So this was quite a long time before Nietzsche.
Well, yes, but I mean, there were a whole series of revolutions, you know, having something of that energy behind it. I mean, even the last one, the Parisian uprising of 1870, setting up the Commune, which is in Nietzsche's lifetime. And then following that, the setting up of the French Third Republic, which was quite strongly anti-clerical, and the Pope from 1870 kind of shut into the Vatican City, and appearing to turn his back on the modern world, and putting every kind of modern the latest work of science on the index as soon as it appeared, and forbidding Catholics to read it.
So the setting up the Commune in 1870, is that to do with communism, or is it something?
It's to do with the beginnings. Yes. It's a few years after the Second International, and even the first. Well, certainly that yes. I mean, it's to do with the socialism was. It was an attempt to create this kind of socialist experiment in Paris, and Nietzsche volunteered as a medical orderly on the Prussian side of the war that put an end to the Paris Commune. Probably the last time he appears as a kind of supporter of the Prussianism. Anyway, so yes, Plato, the idea that there are eternal, unchanging values is very much under attack, if not positively dead. In a way, if anything died in the 19th century, it was kind of the notion of eternal, unchanging values. And you could say that history killed it, or kind of the sort of the tendency to see everything in terms of history.
What about Darwin? Like, did he overlap, or?
Well, Darwin. Well, Darwin had played his part. I mean, his idea of theory of natural selection was based upon how things can come about, life can come about, life can develop even consciousness, humanity, civilization, out of a series of small steps selected by circumstances, leading over immense periods of time. So evolution, was another victory for the principle of seeing things as historical. Since time is a factor. Things arise with time, and that the notion of good is not something with an otherworldly origin. It has historical origins. It comes about in circumstances because of a kind of necessity.
I was just wondering about the difference. You said at the beginning that Nietzsche said that we've gone full circle 2,000 years back to sort of pre-Christian times, but it seems that now there is a difference. It's like because they still had their gods, their fetishes and things like.
Well, they did and they didn't.
Okay.
I mean, Nietzsche's Greeks were something of a Nietzschean creation. He was as a young man, he was headhunted by the University of Basel to be probably the youngest ever professor of classical philology. And he starts off as a classicist. While he was at Basel, he writes the Birth of Tragedy.
Sorry, what's philology?
Philology was strictly it's the science of improving and establishing the best possible version of ancient texts. So, like philosophy is love of wisdom. Philology is love of words. That is the philologist investigates the various surviving manuscripts and works out what is the best version. It comes to involve other things because when it came to involve not just a mechanical process, but the need to enter into the minds and mentality of a past age, to kind of think, well, what was in their minds, what would have been their original words, and also how would the change in mentality of a succeeding age that would have been copying the manuscript, how would they have corrupted the original? So philology can it can border on a kind of psychology, which is kind of the direction in which Nietzsche went. But he went too far. I mean, he was he was employed as a professor of philology, but he was going so much into philosophy and psychology that no students who wanted to study philology enrolled with him because he wasn't doing the proper thing. And then he published his first book, The Birth of Tragedy, which is supposed to be is a book about the origins of Greek tragedy. but people in the mid-19th century couldn't recognize it as such, because it was full of such flights of poetry, and even the creation of Nietzsche's own myths. He was to spend the rest of his career in a kind of myth creating, but it wasn't what a 19th century philologist was supposed to do. He was supposed to keep to his texts and be scientific, quote unquote, at least. So anyway, the University at Basel said that they didn't want him anymore, and Nietzsche kind of felt, well, he didn't want to be a professor of philology either. So they gave him a pension, kind of small pension, which meant that for the rest of his life he could do what he liked, which made possible, the rest of his career, where he lived, kind of spending his summers in Switzerland and his winters in Italy, living in sort of modest boarding houses, writing a new book every year, and in freedom to take it whichever way he wanted. No academics breathing down his neck. He was a kind of free man. I mean, in that sense, it's part of it answer the question: did he live the life? Was he himself an exemplar of what he was recommending? Well, he had the chance to do so, and in a way, he's kind of the model of, I suppose you could say, the academic who breaks free, but certainly the person who starts off as X in some profession or other, and then breaks free, and spends the rest of his career saying, "Look at me, I can do what I like," sort of thing. Which probably set a model that many people followed. I mean, like the lives of many existentialists probably follow that pattern. That one way or another, they kind of emancipate themselves from the day job, by being an existentialist or a kind of freelance, as it were, human exemplar of the ideal, and write books. But I think that Nietzsche did it with a degree of intensity that probably gives him special merit.
So what was he pursuing? Once he'd been set free? What was driving him to do the work?
Well, you could say existential angst, but it did manage to go a bit beyond it. I mean, in the Birth of Tragedy, that's an early work. Near the beginning of the work, he tells this story, probably the first of the Nietzsche stories, which is a story about King Midas. Of course, King Midas in the Greek tradition is a model of the sort of person in pursuit of success and wisdom who gets ass's ears, famously, but because he kind of initiates something that backfires on him, so that's why it's Midas in the story. So Midas. Here's about the wisdom of Silenus. Silenus is a kind of demigod. He's a sort of half animal, half god creature. The sort of king of the satyrs. so he pursues him and captures him and brings him under his power. And Midas has got him. And then he puts his question, I want, give me your wisdom. And then Silenus says, oh, you idiot, oh, you foolish, foolish mortal. You don't want what I've got to give you. What I have to tell you is wisdom, but you won't like to hear it. So Midas's question was, what is the best possible thing that can can befall a human being? What's the best possible thing that could happen? So Silenus's answer is, the best possible thing for a human being is never to have existed. If you fail that one, falling down on that one, then the next best possible thing is to die as quickly as possible. Okay, so it's not a great beginning. So, in a sense, the rest of Nietzsche's life is like a sort of answer to that. It's a bit like sort of waiting for Godot, and you know definitively that Godot's not going to show up, and then what do? Well, Nietzsche kind of he develops what he develops, because Godot, whatever, is not going to show up. We know he's not. We know now definitively he's not going to show up. But here we are, in this field somewhere with a carrot, and that's all we got. And we go past the time. It's why the question of nihilism, pessimism kind of hangs round. The question of pessimism sort of hangs over certainly 19th century culture because of Schopenhauer. So Schopenhauer was, I suppose, he's the sort of notable example of a philosopher who goes deeply into things and actually comes up with a pessimistic, comes up with pessimism. In a way, sort of, Silenus is Schopenhauer. In a way, he's sort of there behind the scenes. And Nietzsche was great friends with Wagner, at least in his early, in his 20s. Wagner kind of thought Nietzsche would be your sort of protege. He'd be kind of spokesman for the great artwork that he was about to. He was sort of trying to create. And Wagner was deeply inspired by Schopenhauer. Nietzsche came across Schopenhauer. Just about nearly all the great sort of 19th century continental thinkers, probably Schopenhauer crosses their path. It's kind of, I think it's the reason for the mustache. Schopenhauer's responsible. It's sort of, it puts that sort of, it gives the 19th century its sort of edge. In the kind of the brown wallpaper is sort of from Schopenhauer.
So what's pessimistic about Schopenhauer?
Well, yes, Schopenhauer. It's not. He is actually. He's not. He's a serious kind of philosopher, but to give a sort of kind of summary, which I'm not going to do justice, but let's say that the kind of bugbear Schopenhauer for a 19th century European is someone who says that the drive behind the world as we experience it, human life itself, is a will to existence, a sort of will. Things want to exist. However, this will is blind. It's not even conscious. Anyway, it blindly generates consciousness, which then becomes will becoming conscious of itself. But the poor, benighted, unfortunate creature who emerges into consciousness realizes that it's engulfed in this octopus-like will from which it can never escape, which wills and wills and wills, and wills its own will, and which your own will is entirely contained within, and never escapes it. And it's a bad thing. It's a bad thing. Life is a bad thing, but we actually can't do it. Now that we've got into it, we can't really do much. There's nothing we can do about it.
So it's quite a mechanistic thing, is it? You're just sort of driven to survive.
Mechanism. No, it's worse than that. It's worse than mechanistic. In a way, it's kind of it's the stuff of the world, the stuff of the material world comes out of will. It's a kind of idealism. It's not saying that we come out of here. We come here out of atoms bumping into each other and scientific laws and we're purely material. This is a kind of idealism. So it's a kind of non-material will, but it's not very nice. I mean, I think God is a pussycat compared to the Schopenhauer, will.
So this will, is it like a transcendental thing? Is it?
It's as bad as that. It's a bit as though you had the transcendental. I mean, instead of the transcendental being good and beautiful and everything that the heart could ever wish for, it's transcendental, but it's kind of the last thing you want. It's like it's pointless, futile, purposeless, ignorant. I mean, it's not really got much going for it. I mean, Schopenhauer, he was interested. I mean, he became interested in Indian philosophy, and even Buddhism, as far as he could, get to understand it in the early 19th century, because, well, Indian philosophy, Indian religion, was interesting because it had this doctrine of moksha, or liberation from the round of existence, from samsara. I mean, in a way, Schopenhauer's will is a sort of samsara, but without any way out. So samsara without any real kind of nirvana. It's like, as though you stared at the wheel of life and you were stuck with it.
I'm wondering if it's like a kind of his will is like a sort of metaphor or something for industrialized capitalist society. Would you think that could make the comparison?
I don't. Schopenhauer wasn't worrying about industrial. I mean, it hardly existed in Germany at that time, and in a sense, it's in a different. It's coming from a different point. It's almost like the opposite of materialism,
Mm.
but it's not a happy outcome either. You see, because it is an ideal, it's a non-materialist.
All right. Yeah, I was just thinking because your description of just sort of this sort of will progressing for no apparent reason and no sort of going beyond it made me think of like workers in factories. You know, just
Well, I mean, that could
working
become
away.
that in expressionist drama, German expressionism, that probably finds its sort of visible expression both in the painters and the filmmakers.
So Schopenhauer wasn't that sort of thing that he was influenced by. Where was he getting this kind of this will from?
Well, I mean, his idea of will was actually his original contribution.
So was his pessimism the fact?
I mean,
Sorry.
yes, this is
His
Schopenhauer.
pessimism was the fact that he couldn't believe that we might have an element of awareness. We might be able to create a better awareness than.
Well, I mean, he did, but it's actually not. Well, I mean, there was a kind of there was a positive. There was something positive, and of course, lying in art, which of course where Wagner comes in. So,
Is Schopenhauer's will part of us or something that's imposed on us from outside?
well, it is us. In a way, we are manifestations of the will. I mean, that is the word. Well, I mean, his title of his great work was the world as will and representation.
No representation.
But the representation is representation of what is thrown up by the will. So in a way, we represent the world, but we're generally in a I mean, insofar as we think it has a purpose, that's our delusion.
For me, it feels like you take this notion of a creator God who's benign and loving,
Yes.
and you remove that concept, but there's still a desire to kind of attach to a creator force that is chaotic, and it feels like he's almost expressing the same kind of, I can't comprehend how it feels like that. It feels
Right.
like it's just an expression of, I just can't comprehend the time, the physiological dynamics, the kind of whatever, in the way that we kind of
Right.
need
Right.
God to answer the question of where do we come from and how do we live in this little bubble.
Well,
He's kind of created something else that's the opposite of that, but a God that's not a God,
Well,
almost.
yes. I mean, this is the area for Nietzsche. I mean, his heroes. And his model for the Superman, Overman, Ubermensch, I'm sure. Let's get on to that one. The good thing about being a professor of classical philology is he knew about the Greeks, and the Greeks are important and a kind of paradigm for Nietzsche, and he thought a paradigm for 19th century humanity, because the Greeks are the ancient Greeks are way before Christianity, and they are confronted. They didn't, being before Christianity, and of course the earlier Greeks, the archaic Greeks, are before Plato. They stare into the abyss, probably the same abyss that 19th century mankind or modern man is having to wake up to. And the great thing about the Greeks is at the point where the most perceptive amongst them woke up to the fact that this actually was their predicament. they didn't lose heart. They went on and created, well, classical culture. That's why it's the birth of tragedy. In his later life, Nietzsche thought that the title of his original work was, the original title was The Birth of Tragedy. He thought that I'm not going to remember that it should be pessimism and heroism. In a sense that there were exemplars of people who have been equal, kind of tracked down Silenus and heard, got the message that the best thing is not to have been, and didn't lose heart. And actually went and created something. I mean, it's still, it's not. It's not. It probably. Well, I mean, depending on how you feel, it might look like cold comfort or not. I mean, the thing is, it depends how you feel about the Greeks or how you feel about the sort of heroic creations of human beings. Whether you think that is an answer to nihilism or pessimism.
Did they have gods, the Greeks?
Well, yes, they did, but it seems that by the gods seem to withdraw. I mean, when you have Aristotle had believed. Actually, he also believed in. He had a god, but his god is a god that is completely separate, completely removed from the world, and in a way, what makes Aristotle's god is that he's completely above and beyond caring about what we do. And he is a sort of a exemplar in that human beings can aspire in their states of contemplation to the sort of serenity that the gods enjoy. But there's not much, you don't look to them. They're not going to do anything for you. I mean, even the Greeks still carried on, making sacrifices. But as antiquity went on, it became a kind of more like a sort of public ceremony. It's not. It isn't. I mean, they even seem to have stopped believing in gods the way that sincere Orthodox Hindus believe in their gods. I mean, the Hindus, contemporary Hindus, will worship and make shrines to their gods because they do believe the gods are going to do something for them. In a way, there is a point to it.
So what did the Greeks do then? Aside from these gods, to sort of combat the pessimism.
Well, I mean, I'm really talking about Nietzsche's gods. In Nietzsche's Greeks,
Okay.
and how he sees their relationship to the God, how the actual historical Greeks were like. I mean, they were, well, in a way that they were probably the ordinary Greeks were believers as much as born again Christians, probably in their own way, but for Nietzsche, you know, the ancient Greek exemplar are the few who wake up to the meaninglessness of existence but still are undaunted by it, who kind of outstare it. In fact, even take it as a spur and a fuel for creation, because Nietzsche's, this is where tension, you know, comes the importance of tension. That Nietzsche thought that the unexampled creativity of the Greeks, these cultural exemplars, arose from the extent that they had faced, sort of outfaced nihilism, that they'd been kind of touched by nihilism.
So what was their creativity? What did you say? They didn't lose heart and they went out and created.
Right.
What did they go out and create?
Well,
Physical things or mental strategies or...
Well, I mean, I'd probably have to sort of stick with Nietzsche's vision of the Greeks, because the actual, you know, historical Greeks are a different case. But the Greeks, as Nietzsche saw them, what enabled them to overcome pessimism was that they discovered the ability to create values, and they were the people who discovered that you could create values out of nothing. In fact, you only could create values out of nothing. I mean, if values are going to come from anywhere, they actually have to come out of nothing. God doesn't give them to you. You don't have. I mean, in a way, that's why maybe in the modern world, some Moses coming down with the tablets of the law becomes, you know, an almost ridiculous figure that we can't take seriously. The idea that the values come from some source beyond the world is one that we don't quite go with. So that's it. That is what made the Greeks, the exemplars.
So was it like they were discovering kind of universal values, or were they?
Well,
was the idea
they
just create a value?
They discovered the value of what they called agon, which is struggle, competition. They discovered the value of an inner tension. And Nietzsche's view of the Greeks, that the Greeks were a creative power for as long as they kept up the tension. When they relaxed the tension, then they became less creative. In a way, they became formulaic. In fact, they became content too. They became content, happy to keep repeating the forms that the Greeks in their creative days had invented when they were real discoverers and inventors of values.
So is this the tension between order and chaos, or is it?
Probably, and even maybe a tension between good and bad.
How do they maintain a tension? What's the how does that work? I mean, like what's not having a tension and what is having a tension between? between that? What would a society look like that had a tension
Right.
or didn't have a tension between those two forces?
Well, it would be a culture and a society that set up truth and honesty as the highest value.
Hmm.
So, the Greek Sophocles created the character of Oedipus, a solver of riddles. What makes Oedipus as a tragic figure is that he begins his quest for that there's plague in his city. He undertakes to end the plague by an uncompromising inquest into the truth. He will set about uncovering the truth, no matter what it is, no matter what it turns out to be. And the drama, as it were, kind of inexorably sort of inches forward, and the truth, the truth that he kind of sets up, that he's determined to hunt out and fish out, and even though Jocasta is whispering to him, you might be going a bit too far here. And Teresa's saying, well, you don't want to hear what I've got to tell you. He just ignores that because he's going all out. He wants the truth. Nothing, he'll go for truth, no matter what it is. And so the truth turns out to be, he killed his father and he married his mother. And these plays come in, the Greek plays came in trilogies, so the great tragedies would become in sets of 3 plays. And I think the climax of the series, the sort of the Oedipus series is Oedipus at Colonus, where Oedipus, he blinds himself, he becomes a homeless wanderer. He's kind of wandering around as an outcast. He's polluted. He's done the unspeakable. But at the end, there's a vision of him off stage, where he undergoes a kind of apotheosis. In a sense, he does manage to expiate. Well, this is the actual Sophocles.
So what do you mean apotheosis?
He's redeemed,
Okay.
as it were. In spite of the fact that he's married his mother, killed his father. Somehow, because he went out, he never swerved from his commitment to the truth.
Mm.
Then somehow that redeems him. In a way, he comes out of it.
Mm.
It's like kind of Goethe's Faust. That all right, he doesn't. He sells his soul to the devil and makes a pact with the devil. But in a corner of Faust's soul, there is an integrity that he never surrenders. And in fact, in Goethe's Faust, that's part of the bargain. That if I spend all my time with you, and subject myself to all your temptations and all your sort of skepticism and everything you throw at me. If I still maintain my basic integrity, you don't get my soul. And of course you have another happy ending. Faust is not damned. So I mean, this is a sort of Western myth, peculiarly Western myth, where you have the hero who's a sort of anti-hero most of the time, does all the wrong things and a few unspeakable things, and somehow comes good at the end and turns out to be better than all the rest. In a way, there you have tension. Of course.
So why would they be better than all the rest?
Well, because in this Western tradition that kind of Nietzsche is sort of saying is the Western tradition, what the great exemplars do is they face the worst and survive it. It's a bit and I got this sort of ridiculous analogy from The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, but maybe the ridiculousness kind of makes a point as the ubiquitousness that never seems to get away from it. There's this episode where there is this ultimate truth machine, I think. Which no one can spend the night in without going mad. And Beetlejuice is kind of sort of coolly says, well, he'll spend the night there, and spends the night, and is confronted with ultimate reality. And comes out, and is perfectly cool as a cucumber. And I mean, that this is sort of popular culture and entertainment, but in a sense, there's a sort of streak running through, the Western culture that keeps coming up. It's sort of this sort of myth of the person who faces, I mean, in a way, what the ultimate truth machine inflicts is the wisdom of Silenus that basically it'd be far better not to be, because you're nothing.
Is Joseph Campbell's hero with the thousand faces, isn't
Yes, again, yes, it surfaces. Although yes, Joseph Campbell's a bit more upbeat.
So the idea basically, isn't it, that you go to some wild and alien place and
yes.
return with precious knowledge.
It's that myth that keeps coming. I mean, so does even Dante's Divine Comedy. He goes down. He has to. Virgil tells him that, well, if you want to climb the mountain, you've actually got to face the worst of hell, the absolute worst and worst, the worst of the worst of hell, and go through the absolute nadir and bottom of everything, to get there, which he does and undertakes the journey. It's a sort of, I mean, it's a sort of myth that seems to keep coming up. So, yes, I suppose the original question was, what's the positive? What sustains you? One way or another, you confront Silenus or the ultimate truth machine or reality or kind of sort of you go through it, and you face the ultimate meaninglessness, and how do you carry on? So, and I said, it's Nietzsche thought it was what you've got to do, and anything you can do is create values. in a way, values are the thing to die for. And in fact, it was the thing that I mean, that's why, I mean, Nietzsche thought that Schopenhauer got it wrong. You know, with his doctrine of the will, that if you like, the creation of values is actually the thing that is overcomes this will. It's beyond the, you know, in a way that's what confronts the will, and it releases you from pessimism and nihilism.
So did Nietzsche create some values, or suggest how?
Well,
we might do that?
that's the question. I mean, people got very excited about on reading Nietzsche, and the best commentators combed through kind of Nietzsche to kind of see, you know, where to kind of spot the point where he kind of unveils these values, where he actually does it, and it's a bit elusive. In a sense, maybe, I mean, Nietzsche himself thought that he was a bit too early. That it was something his successors would do, his followers, the men of the future, perhaps us, people coming after him. He sort of lays the task on the table and saying, this is the situation, this is the extremity, this is the size of the problem. I haven't got the answer. I've given you the problem. Now you find the answer.
So is it a collective kind of problem of like society's got to form the values, or is it an individual?
Well, I mean, it's faced by each individual, but he thought that that Western society was heading for it. That, I mean, there's in one of his works he comes up with, you know, another Nietzsche myth, a Nietzsche story. It's the story of the madman. And some people think the madman is Nietzsche himself. Some people do think Nietzsche was the madman. But, so the story goes that one day in the marketplace, you know, people are gathered, and there's this strange madman turns up in the middle of the day with a lighted lantern, saying, "I'm looking for God. I'm looking for God. Can anyone tell me where to find him?" Now, as chance would have it, and probably deliberately, the people he comes across in this marketplace, and it happens to be a marketplace full of atheists, you know, 19th century atheists, as it happens, and they have great fun with this madman with his lighted lantern, who's calling out, you know, "Where is God? Where is God?" And they make fun of him. They say, "Well, have you mislaid him? Did he go for a walk and get lost? You know, maybe if you could have waited a bit, he might show up." And the madman kind of twigs that you know, these atheists they're not understanding, or they actually haven't got hold of the size of the problem. And he turns, you know, on the bystanders and says, you know, God is dead. There's one of those God is dead moments in Nietzsche. But then he says, and I tell you, and he didn't just die a natural death. You murdered him. You know, what on earth are we going to do? I mean, can you know, to be the murderers of God, what a crime. and then there's this long. He goes this sort of speech, which is almost like describing this world where where God has been murdered, and it kind of sounds like late 19th century kind of abyss-staring science fiction. It's like the end of H.G. Wells's The Time Machine. Where everything, where the Earth, the Earth has been is been set loose from the sun, as is wandering in the empty spaces, and everything's getting colder and it's getting darker and it's getting so dark. I have to light a lantern in the middle of daylight, and it's getting darker and colder, and everything everything's running down, and we're completely lost. And then so he gives this long speech. And then at the end of it, he smashes his lantern and says, "I've come too early. The moment is not yet. The tremendous event is still coming."
So do you think we're still kind of coasting a bit, like so God's died, we had the values,
Right.
and we're just coasting a while, and the values are gradually breaking down until we have this.
Well, some people have thought. I mean, yes, that's an opinion you'll hear. That we're kind of living off the dividends of past ages.
But why did he depict the guy as a madman, the one that was attempting to bring them to their senses?
Well, it might be. I mean, I'm wondering whether that might be a reminiscence of Plato's cave. Because in Plato's cave, you've got the situation in the cave. There are people who are chained down all their lives, facing the back wall of the cave, and behind them is a bonfire, and the fire behind them is casting shadows, and people are walking behind them carrying the images of the gods, and the people sitting in the cave have never turned round. That they're fixed. They can't turn around and see what's can't see what's going on behind them. They take the shadows on the cave wall as being the reality. So these images of the gods, they think are the gods. They don't know that they're just images, not even just they're shadows of what are just images. Then in Plato's story, someone who's been chained down is released. He's taken. He gets out of the cave. Sees sees a real sunlight, sees real things, and then he comes back into the cave, sees what's going on, sees this bonfire, sees these these sort of representations, kind of being passed off as the gods, and then he starts telling the people who've been sitting there. Look, these things that you take as real, they're just fictions. That they're not real. That it's just a trick. And they turn on him, telling he's a madman. He's crazy. How can you're completely out of your mind to be saying things like that. We can see it's not true. No one. You can't give us any rational proof. You can't prove it. All makes perfect sense to us. And who doubts their senses? So I mean that's. I mean there is and then from the time of Plato's cave, there's a sort of tradition of the person who sees the truth. People are deluded. Comes back. Tries to tell people that they're deluded, but people can hold on to their delusion, and accuse him of being the one who's crazy.
Also, to be fair, Nietzsche has already been ejected from academia.
Well, yes.
So he's an outsider, who's bound to.
Well, yes, in some, yes, of course. That I mean, he partly, yes. I mean, he also, to some extent, chose it, as well as. I mean, you know, if you'd been a half decent, conventional 19th century character, he could have carried on.
Yeah, there's probably some chicken and egg between
But
the myth and the life story.
he wasn't the sort of person to compromise at all. So, you know.
Did that affect how he was received by people?
Well, I think that it meant that there was a small delay. I mean, you know, there's supposed to be a kind of pathos about Nietzsche's life, that no one listened to him. But if he'd have been, you know, if he'd actually had still been around, if he could have stayed around for another 10 years, he would actually have been, you know, almost quite sort of lionized by a new, younger generation. As it was, he wasn't away. He was out of, you know, his mental breakdown sort of took him out of circulation. But even by 1900, people, I mean, Richard Strauss was composing, you know, symphonies. His symphony after Thus Spake, you know, Thus Spoke Zarathustra, you know, made famous by 2001: Space Odyssey, which is has a connection with Nietzsche. So by 1900, he was a famous figure and had a following, but he was, you know, it was too late.
So it's not that his philosophy was too radical to be accepted.
Not really. In a certain, it was. I mean, in a way that the artists and writers were ready for him. Maybe not academic thinkers, or maybe not philosophers, in the sense that the artists and writers were ready to end the 19th century before the thinkers were. In a way, it was still the age of progress and you know, science, you know, right up to 1914, as far as kind of the spokesmen were. But well before 1914, there were artists who were ready to sort of be like the canaries taken down the mine, who actually, instead of, I mean, canaries taken down the mine, the warning signal is they stop singing or go quiet, but these canaries start squawking. I mean, it could have in 1889, the Belgian artist, in fact, it was just well, that's the year in which Nietzsche has his breakdown. But James Ensor, who was a Belgian artist, painted his Christ's entry into Brussels, which is anything but Christ's entrance into Brussels. It's this huge, monumental panorama of this sort of procession of masks and skulls marching into Brussels, which is a sort of kind of death of God, in a way. By 1889, the death of God sort of found its sort of visual equivalent. You know, painters were ready to paint it, even if no one else was ready to theorize on it.
Would you mind if...
Or break for a little? Yes, yes, we should. In fact, let's have a general.
I'm not sure what time it is.
I mean, it's the halfway point.
Is it?